Good morning, students. We're going to start with understanding of chapter number 7, that is sources of business finance. Now, business finance is a word which is made up of two individual words, business and finance. We've already learned the meaning of business. It is an economic activity which is done on a regular basis which involves manufacturing or trading of goods and services with the motive to earn profit. And where we are understanding finance in a general term, it means money. So it refers to the money which is required to carry out business activities. Now money is also known as the lifeblood of business. Now students, we have learned in chapter number 1 that capital or investment of capital is very much essential in business. So sometimes money and finance is also known as the lifeblood of business. Now why a business needs a finance? Business needs the finance right from the A point to start and establish a business, to run day-to-day activities of business, like suppose we have to purchase the raw material, we have to pay the wages and salaries of the employees, electricity bill, etc. We also require business finance for just modernizing our business, for expansion of the business, for diversification. What do you mean by diversification? That means changing from one business to another. For example, right now you are dealing in that of sugar business, but now you want to deal in that of cement business. At that time you have to diversify your whole business from one into the another. Next one, you also require business finance to purchase various fixed assets of the business like land, building, plant, machinery, etc. So for all these things we require business finance right from the beginning to start the business and to carry out day-to-day activities, to purchase the fixed assets for our business, for the modernization, expansion and diversification of business. Coming to the next one, that is classification of business requirement. Now we require business finance for two major purposes. The one is classified as fixed capital requirement, the another one is known as working capital requirement. Now fixed capital requirement means when a business requires huge amount of funds to be invested for a longer period of time in various fixed assets, it is known as fixed capital requirement. So students, when we are just investing a huge amount of funds for a very longer period of time in various fixed assets, it is known as fixed capital requirement. Suppose we require 2 crores to purchase any land for our business. At that time it will be termed as fixed capital requirement. Second one is your working capital requirement. Now whenever you are just requiring finance to maintain your current assets like debtor, bills receivable, or at the same time for meeting day-to-day expenses of the business, it is known as working capital requirement. Okay, so a business selling goods majorly on credit basis will have more working capital requirement. Why? Because more of the funds which he have earned from selling the goods will be blocked in debtors. So here working capital requirement will be quite more in case of credit sales. Now we're going to learn classification of sources of finance. Now sources of finance can be classified on periodic basis also, on ownership basis also, and on generation basis also. So we're going to understand first periodic basis of classification of sources of finance. Now according to the periodic basis, the sources of business finance can be classified into three categories. First one is long term source, second one is medium term source, and the third one is short term source. Okay, now long term source means all those sources which a business is requiring for a period of more than 5 years, and it is known as long term sources. All these things are known as, or these various sources of finance which are coming under the long term sources are shares, debentures, long term loans from the bank. Second one, medium term source. Now whatever sources which are being required by the business for the period of more than 1 year but less than 5 years, then it will be termed as medium term source. Example, public deposits. You only have to just understand the examples. We're going to just understand all these examples like shares, debentures, public deposits in a detailed basis in the upcoming topics. Coming to the next one, that is short term source. Now whenever we are requiring business finance for a period of less than a year, then it is known as short term source. Okay, and the short term source is your trade credit. You have understood accounts bills of exchange chapter, in which you are selling the goods on credit, and within a period of 1 year the bill gets mature and a person gets the amount. This is known as your trade credit. So on the periodic basis there are three kinds of sources of finance: short term, medium term and long term. Short term, you require finance for a period less than 1 year. Medium term, you require a finance for a period less than 5 years but more than 1 year, and then you require the finance for period more than 5 years. Okay, now we're going to understand the classification of finance on ownership basis. Now, on the ownership basis, the first one is your owner's funds. Such funds are provided by the owners of business. Now, whatever capital which is being invested by the owner of the business himself, that particular funds are known as ownership funds or owner's fund. It is also known as equity. It is a very permanent source of finance because it remain invested into the business for a longer period of time till the owner continues with the business. It also provides right of control of management also. Now, whenever a owner is injecting capital into the business, at that time he also automatically acquires right to control the business also. Okay, आप किसी बिजनेस में पैसा लगाओगे तो आप वहाँ पे बोलने का अधिकार भी रखोगे, उस बिजनेस को कंट्रोल करने का अधिकार भी रखोगे. Examples of owners fund is equity share capital, retained earnings. This all will going to understand all these topics in the upcoming topics of the chapter. Okay. Now, another ownership classification is your borrowed funds. Now, whenever we are raising the finance from the external sources or from that of the forms of borrowings or loans from that of the banks, at that time it is known as borrowed funds. Now, these sources provide funds for a specific time period, no doubt. Whenever we are obtaining or borrowing the loans from the bank, it is for a particular specific time period. So, for 10 years, 5 years, 15 years. It also carries a legal obligation to pay the principal amount along with that of the interest, and sometimes borrowed funds also needs an hypothecation of assets or securities of fixed assets. Okay, so three things we have to keep in mind regarding the borrowed funds. That means whenever we are borrowing the funds from that of the bank, at that time we have to have an obligation of compulsory payment of principal amount along with that of the interest, and sometimes you have to just have the security of the fixed assets, and these are being obtained for a specific period of time. Now, coming to the next one, that is classification of sources of finance on a generation basis. First one is your internal source and the second one is your external source. Now, when the funds are being generated from within the business, it is known as internal source, and the example is retained earnings. Whenever we are generating the sources of business finance from outside the organization, it is now known as external source. So here we have completed with the very first portion of chapter number 7, that is sources of business finance. We're going to catch with the later topics in the later video. Thank you so much.